The Holy Bible, a compilation of 66 books divided into two separate testaments. In its standard English version, almost 800,000 words. Words of enduring value, the cornerstone of our laws, ethics, moral code, and the fountainhead of faith for nearly half the population of the world.
Now these are the commandments, the statutes and the judgments, which the Lord your God commanded to teach you, that ye might do them in the land whither ye go. Deuteronomy 6:1.
Said to contain the Word of God, the Bible is a book of inspiration, of immense beauty, wisdom, and compassion. It has been translated into almost every language on earth, yet its origins are shrouded in obscurity. We know little of its compilation. Are the words of God undiluted? Have they come down to us in their original form, as first uttered by the divine? And who was it who first set down the eternal words in writing?
Some people tend to have the idea that the King James Version of the Bible dropped down from heaven one day and, oh, there's the Bible. No, the Bible is a library, and libraries get built only over long, long years and centuries.
It's the product of a whole community of people, of men and women, and they're spread apart by about 1,000 years from the earliest word in the Hebrew Bible to the last word in the Hebrew Bible. Now that's extraordinary.
I would agree with many of the Jewish rabbis who believe that the Old Testament scriptures, particularly the law of Moses and so on, are so spiritually unabridged that no human mind can ever comprehend everything that God has written there.
The Bible embodies a detailed record of human history, bridging two of the world's greatest faiths. The New Testament enshrines the story of the one called Jesus, yet even that telling is cloaked in mystery.
We do not know where any of the Gospels were written, or when they were written, or by whom they were written. Those are all things that we have to conjecture.
How do we have this document, this group of texts really that have been written at different places at different times by different people? Why were they drawn together? Because as we study them and understand them historically, we see that they come from the most disparate groups who cannot possibly have agreed with each other on things. So why were they ever gathered all together?
Is the origin of the Bible as indefinable as the emergence of religion itself? As old as humankind's earliest quest for the divine? Are we able to identify those who handed the book of books down to us? The clues to unlocking the riddle may be hidden within these ancient texts, but for each discovery made, for every answer found, a new question arises, forever compelling scholars to probe the mystery of who wrote the Bible. The people who once walked this ancient land bequeathed to us a timeless legacy, the Holy Bible. The book we know today may have been the result of a fusion of stories, ideas, traditions, and chronologies, woven together over a span of 1,000 years or more. encompassing the period between the Exodus from Egypt and the life of Christ. The Bible is the world's perennial bestseller, with close on 100 million new copies printed each year. To trace its lineage is to embark on an extraordinary journey. But, understandably, it is a quest not without controversy, for some of our deepest and most passionate convictions are intertwined with this book, held to be sacred by so many. What proportion of the Bible contains the sacred Word of God, and how much of it is the work of mortal mind? Do the stories cross the boundaries separating legend from history? Are all the original books still within the Bible, or have any of the ancient texts been lost? These are questions that have puzzled the scholar. But the heroic deeds of ordinary men and women, a pageantry of prophets, priests, villains, heroes, and kings, who played a role in creating the Bible, are separated from us by an immeasurable period of time. Only their ghosts and echoes linger. To trace their path, our journey of discovery into the origins of both the Old and the New Testaments begins here in the Middle East. The region still holds many secrets of those long-gone days, but the landscape is frustratingly silent on the mystery of how the most revered book in human history came to be written. Occasionally, the sands yield a tiny piece of a puzzle that sheds some light on the biblical narrative. But it is to the texts themselves that the scholar must turn to learn how and when the Bible came into being. Locked within these words are the answers to the origin of the Holy Book. The task is a difficult one. Centuries of translation and editing may have left us with little semblance of the original writings, especially regarding the oldest of the Bible's books, the Pentateuch, known as the Hebrew Torah, or the 5 books of Moses. Moses is said to have received the holy words from God here on Mount Sinai during the Exodus from Egypt. The Bible tells us that Moses himself wrote them down and passed them on to the people.
And Moses wrote this law, and delivered it unto the priests, the sons of Levi, which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and unto all the elders of Israel. Deuteronomy 31:9.
Religious tradition has taught us that God revealed it to Moses at Sinai. And yet, no matter how much we grapple with the problem, it's very hard not to see some aspect of human interference or intervention or perhaps literary activity in this massive set of texts that we call the Torah.
The Torah itself never exactly claims that Moses wrote all of it. There's a section that says Moses wrote down these words, but it never says, and all the other words in this book. The belief originated in pre-rabbinic and rabbinic times, the first couple of centuries BCE, for lots of reasons, not the least of which was you can't establish the authority of the book any better than saying God wrote it.
The question of who wrote the Bible has often prompted a defensive response from church and synagogue. From a traditional viewpoint, the holy texts are sacrosanct words, imparted or inspired by the divine. Understandably, even now, to many, the authorship of the Bible remains beyond doubt.
We believe that the Torah was written by the hand of Moses, but dictated to him by God himself in a totally divine manner. No different than you would dictate a letter to a secretary.
God could have used angels, God could have written it himself, God could have spoken it into written form. He chose, being the omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent one, to use human beings since his message is to man. Therefore, whether Moses writing the Pentateuch, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John writing the Gospels, or any of the 40 men and women who were instrumental, each of them, under divine inspiration, wrote verbatim, totally verbatim, as God instructed, but through their own personality.
It is believed that the communal campfire was the stage around which the first biblical stories were transmitted. Histories and genealogies were passed down by word of mouth, told and retold many times. Epic sagas of conflict, deliverance, and redemption were reenacted, with accounts of ancestral contact with the divine conveyed verbally from generation to generation. The Bible is divided into two distinct sections. The first is the so-called Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. In it are the 5 books of Moses, from Genesis through Deuteronomy, also known as the Law. Next are the history books, or the prophets, including Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Finally, there are the writings, which include the book of Psalms, Proverbs, Lamentations, and Chronicles. 39 works in all. The New Testament, the texts that deal with the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, comprise 27 books, divided into the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then the Acts of the Apostles and the letters. And finally, the book of Revelation. But these are not the only religious texts. They are merely those that were canonized or accepted as worthy of inclusion in the Bible by various ecclesiastical authorities throughout the centuries. A volume of books known as the Apocrypha is sometimes included as an addendum to the Bible. These books, encompassing prophecies, poems, and histories, were at one time included in the Hebrew Bible, but were dropped from the official canon just before the Christian era. Any quest for original authorship should begin with the foundation of the entire structure. So the focus has invariably been on the earliest texts, on the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. As scholars began to plumb the rich depth of the biblical narrative, astonishing patterns began to emerge. Clearly, the texts seem to contain a multitude of different writing styles. Could they be the work of many minds, many authors, many contributors? If so, who were they? And is it possible that the Word of God is being revealed in all of their versions? A gradual revelation still going on. When Muhammad Adib, a young Arab boy in search of a lost goat, stumbles across a dusty cache of pottery jars in a cave near Qumran in 1947, he stuns the world. This is the oldest and most fabulous biblical treasure ever found, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The discovery of the library on the Dead Sea, of all of this material, which we call Dead Sea Scrolls, has been crucial to our understanding of the Bible and the nature of it and who wrote it and when and how and why and what. Because this library revealed a piece, at least, of every book in the Bible, except Esther, in a manuscript which was 1,000 years older than the oldest Hebrew manuscript we ever had.
Now housed in Jerusalem's Shrine of the Book, the scrolls were written during an era that spanned the last 300 years of Judaism before the destruction of its holiest place, the Great Temple. They speak of a coming schism that would splinter the faith into opposing factions. Compelling and evocative, the scrolls were written at the time that a new religion, Christianity, was being born. Much of the literature contained within the scrolls may well have been known to Jesus himself.
Do not take riches from a man you do not know, lest it only add to your poverty. If God has ordained that you should die in your poverty, so he has appointed it. But do not corrupt your spirit because of it. Dead Sea Scroll, number 4Q416.
Between 1947 and 1960, 11 caves yielded a total of 800 scrolls and an abundance of manuscript fragments from where they had lain undisturbed for 2,000 years. Written on parchment and papyrus, a diverse range of text appears among the scrolls. Most are written in Hebrew, but there is a smattering of Greek and Aramaic. 127 of the documents represent canonized texts, the same as those appearing in modern Bibles. But many of the scrolls contain passages that are new and unfamiliar to scholars. A few of the documents appear as many as 19 times, written by different scribes, indicating that the collection may have been assembled from a variety of sources.
We have discovered that there were in circulation different manuscripts of the same book. The book of Samuel is better than the book which we have, longer, more detailed. The book of Jeremiah is worse, shorter and more confused. So the general rule is that the Dead Sea Scrolls have encouraged us to accept the validity of the text, the Hebrew text which we have, but to acknowledge the fact that there were other texts in circulation.
Were the scrolls based on even earlier, more ancient writings? And who collected them in this remote and barren wilderness? And why? The answer may lie here, in the nearby settlement of Qumran. It was once occupied by a reclusive Jewish sect known as the Essenes. The word Essene comes from Aramaic, meaning pious or healer. The sect had broken away from the mainstream of Judaism about a century and a half before the Jews' fateful war with the Romans. Choosing to live an isolated life in the desert, they dedicated themselves to religious worship in anticipation of a long-awaited Messiah, even as Jesus was about to make his entrance into history. Deeply pacifistic, the Essenes were most likely responsible for hiding the scrolls. But why? Scholars have searched the ruins in vain for answers. Did the sect believe that the Romans would destroy the temple in Jerusalem and had therefore brought its holy documents to Qumran for safekeeping? Perhaps not. For as the texts were translated, it became clear that the Essenes and the Jerusalem priests were not in agreement with one another on fundamental religious issues.
Mixing is forbidden, because the people are holy, and the sons of Aaron are the holy of holies. Nevertheless, as you know, some of the priests and the people are mixing. They are intermarrying and thereby polluting the holy seed. Dead Sea Scroll, number 4Q398.
The most unusual manuscript in the collection is a copper scroll found in cave number 3. It lists 64 locations of buried treasure in the area, but nothing has ever been found.
It appears that the copper scroll was written on copper rather than on leather like all the other scrolls or papyrus, for the reason that it was a treasure list, a document from the temple. And documents from the temple, that is, official documents, often were written on copper, to judge from parallels in other temples.
Since the scrolls were buried at the time the Romans finally destroyed the temple, some scholars have speculated that the people who hid them may also have been responsible for hiding the temple treasures and religious artifacts. But this too is unlikely, due to the deep division between the Essenes and the Jerusalem priests. While providing tantalizing insight into the politics of the time, the scrolls say surprisingly little about who wrote them or who hid them in these soaring cliffs.
I think the scrolls were probably put in the caves by a group of people who expected to return and get them. At the time of the Great War with Rome, which went from 66 to 70, it's probably the case that only a few people knew where they were. There are hundreds and hundreds of caves to be seen in the area where the scrolls were found, and it cannot have been a common knowledge which ones contained these great treasures. So the ones who had the keys perished, probably at the hands of the Romans.
Buried when Jesus walked the Holy Land, preaching a new view of the world, just before a war in which Rome almost annihilated the people of Israel, the scrolls preserved in the caves of Qumran offer a few clues about their authors. But they have provided dramatic insight into the diverse range of texts that existed long before the Holy Scriptures were compiled into the single work we now know as the Bible. Almost 1,000 years ago, it was first noticed that there were seemingly contradictory passages in the text of the first 5 books of Moses. Many words were ascribed to Moses, but unlikely to have been written by him.
So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab. Deuteronomy 34:5.
Scholars have argued that if Moses was the author of the book of Deuteronomy, how could it have been possible for him to have written about his own death?
The problem of how Moses could have been the one who recorded and passed on the Torah, and then it turns out to describe his own death, was already raised by the sages, and they simply answered by giving 2 possibilities. One, that Moses did indeed write of his own death while crying as he wrote. And second of all, that those verses of the Torah were written by his faithful servant and his successor Joshua.
But there were even more puzzling sections in the texts, some of them as early as the book of Genesis.
And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. Genesis 6:19.
That excerpt is from the story of Noah and the flood. Just a few sentences farther, there is this surprising discrepancy, quoting a different number of animals to be taken into the ark.
Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. Genesis 7:2.
Was it 2 of each kind of animal, or 7 of each clean animal? The texts contain other oddities. There are numerous examples of the same story told twice, sometimes with conflicting details. Scholars have long referred to these as doublets. There are 2 separate accounts of the creation of the world, 2 versions of the covenant made between God and the patriarch Abraham, and even 2 distinct versions of Moses obtaining water from a rock at a place called Meribah during the Exodus. In most instances of these so-called doublets, the two versions of the story each referred to God by a different name. In the Hebrew text, sometimes the deity is referred to as Elohim, the usual Hebrew reference to God. But in the alternative version, the term used is often Yahweh or Lord. For centuries, scholars have puzzled over the appearance of these distinct differences.
The key piece of evidence in this is that different kinds of clues converged with each other, so that you have doublets of stories, that proves nothing. You have different names of God, that proves nothing. But when all the doublets of stories line up into two groups, one of which uses one name of God and one uses the other name of God consistently, then that's strong evidence that something is going on.
By the early half of the 19th century, many scholars were convinced that the 5 books of Moses were written by 3 separate authors. The writer of the version which referred to God as Yahweh was named J, because early European translators were ignorant of the correct pronunciation of Hebrew names. Many inadvertently referred to the name of God as Jehovah instead of Yahweh. And ironically, the name has stuck. The author of those texts referring to God as Elohim was named E. A third writer was identified as P. This author was thought to be a priest and wrote in a different style to J and E. His passages seem to be especially concerned with stories of the establishment of the priesthood after the people of Israel left Egypt.
All these texts are written in Hebrew, but in a different stage of Hebrew that we can identify. And each has its own favorite terms, words that occur 50 times in P but never occur in E or J, that sort of thing. And each has its own style.
The differences are immediately obvious in Hebrew, the language in which the text was originally written. The disparities virtually disappear in their English translation, but this example comes from the book of Exodus. The text relates how God appears to Moses in a burning bush. The passage was written by J, who in Hebrew refers to God as Yahweh or Lord.
And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Exodus 3:2.
When the E writer discusses Moses confronting the burning bush, the name used for the deity is now only Elohim, God.
Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Exodus 3:6.
Subtle though the differences may be, the texts clearly seem to reflect a compilation of sources. In 1807, the German theologian Wilhelm de Wet announced the discovery of a possible 4th author. His examination of the texts indicated that the language, tone, and content of the entire book of Deuteronomy were the work of a different person to J, E, or P. Scholars have since come to refer to this writer by the name D, for Deuteronomist. Over the years, the authorship theory has come to be known as the documentary hypothesis.
Once you've identified a text and said, well, I think this is J, or I think this is E, I think this is P, I think this is D, then you place it up against other texts in the Bible where we have some idea of the date and see if there's any development in the language. It's not just that you can tell the difference between the way I speak English and the way Shakespeare did. It's that if you heard somebody who lived in the 18th century, you could tell that that person was somewhere halfway between Shakespeare and me. So you can see the stages of biblical Hebrew in growth.
In a stunning retraction of early church intolerance toward the hypothesis and the issue of biblical authorship, in 1943, Pope Pius XII surprises religious leaders and academics alike by issuing a new edict. He encourages scholars to fully investigate the question, who wrote the Bible?
His disciples and said, "Take this, all of you, and drink from it."
The directive was heralded as a Magna Carta for biblical study, initiating unprecedented research into the origins of the Holy Book. The quest would open up a fascinating window on how the sacred words of the divine have traversed the centuries. The Bible is the central pillar upon which much of Western civilization has been built. For untold centuries, it has served as one of humanity's principal guiding beacons. Yet its very origins are now being called into question. The search for answers concerning its authorship may seem circuitous, but it will bring us into direct contact with the signature of a man who may have written at least one of the 5 books of Moses. Our quest must go back some 35 centuries, to the time when the people of Israel approached the borders of the Promised Land. After decades of wandering, the Hebrews eventually crossed the River Jordan and settled in Canaan. While the 10 Commandments were constantly in the possession of the people, there may have been no other religious texts at the time. Though the Bible indicates that the scrolls of Moses may have accompanied the Israelites, many scholars believe that the first 5 books of the Bible had not yet been written. After the advent of the monarchy, in about 1000 before the Common Era, King David eventually becomes ruler and establishes his new capital at Jerusalem. It is then that the matter of authorship re-enters the story. The king breaks with tradition by appointing 2 high priests in charge of religious affairs instead of 1.
It's not so strange to have 2 high priests. In Israel today, there are 2 chief rabbis. The problem is when you have 2 chief priests instead of 1, each one spends most of his day sitting there thinking about how to get rid of the other one.
Not only are there 2 high priests, but towards the end of his reign, 2 of King David's sons are vying for the throne. It is uncertain which of them will be appointed the royal successor. A struggle for power ensues, and this embroils the high priests. Each one supports a different royal candidate. When David dies, it is Solomon who is chosen to wear the crown. Now the question is, will Solomon retain the services of both priests, or return to the traditional practice of having only one man in charge of the nation's religious affairs? Not surprisingly, the priest who was loyal to Solomon during his candidacy is chosen. At the same time, the second priest is removed from power and banished from the kingdom.
And unto Abiathar the priest said the king, "Get thee to Anatot, unto thine own fields, for thou art worthy of death." So Solomon thrust out Abiathar from being priest unto the Lord. 1 Kings 2:26.
Thus, the priest retained by Solomon assumes an exclusive role. He and his assistants would soon take on new responsibilities as the king begins constructing the first great temple in Jerusalem. The deposed priest and his followers enviously watch from their place of banishment. They are now cut off from any possible future duties in the new temple.
They had no place in the royal kingdom in Jerusalem. And so a priest of that priestly house, we think, initiated the rebellion that ultimately led to the formation of the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. They wanted their own place where they could get to be the priests as well.
Thus, in 922 BCE, the 10 northerly tribes sever their allegiance to Jerusalem, and secession splinters the nation in two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So two kingdoms born of a single nation oppose one another in an uneasy truce.
Each had its own king, each had its own traditions, its own sacred places of worship. At the same time, we're talking about a region that's the size of a large American county, so people were close to each other, people had relatives north and south, they both spoke the same language, and they both had the same old traditions of ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and events in Egypt with Moses and events at Mount Sinai. And so it is thought that each kingdom produced its sacred text, or at least that one person living in each kingdom produced his version of the sacred text.
If this is so, is it possible that separate versions of the Bible were taking shape at the same time?
We think that the J material was first gathered together under King Solomon. It represents Solomon's attempt to gather up the stories of a people, to knit them together into a coherent narrative to tell the story about how the people of Israel came to be a people. And so it became a kind of national epic.
In answer to Solomon and his history of the people of Judah, the people of the northern kingdom of Israel now begin to amass their own collection of historical stories.
What they want to do is they want to add to this material that is more northern in orientation. And so they add material, and we think that this material is what we call E, because they tend to use the word Elohim for God. Now we have somewhat more sophisticated theological stories. But interestingly enough, we also have stories that tend to emphasize the significance of the second son. Many people who read Genesis notice, how come it's always the second son that comes out better? Isaac was after Ishmael, Jacob, Cain and Abel. I mean, all of these stories seem to emphasize the second son as the important one, or the preferred son. It could very well be that the northern kingdom, after their break, wanted to emphasize the second son because, in a sense, they were the second son. They were the breakaway kingdom. So they wanted to portray themselves as the preferred of the two.
Unlike the Bible's favored second son, however, the kingdom of Israel slips into the grip of paganism. As time passes, the people begin to worship Canaanite gods. They would suffer a long and difficult history under 19 kings, 8 of whom would die violently. Despite the warnings of prophets, moral decay and corruption continue to enslave the people. Then, 7.5 centuries before the birth of Christ, the prophecies come true. An invading Assyrian army sweeps in from the north and conquers Israel, forever scattering the 10 tribes to the winds, never to be seen nor heard from again. They become the so-called lost tribes of Israel.
Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them from out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only. 2 Kings 17:18.
Together with the small tribe of Benjamin, the southern kingdom of Judah remains all that is left of the nation that had once settled the promised land. But an unremitting spiritual downfall has now gripped Judah too. Without any consolidated religious precepts, no laws, no sacred texts, paganism becomes rife throughout the land until King Josiah takes the throne. He tries to usher in change by outlawing idol worship and by a return to the holy covenant made with God at Mount Sinai.
Josiah was the young king who, as soon as he comes to the throne, decides that he wants to reform the religion of the people towards a more spiritual attachment to Yahweh, the national God. And so Josiah starts this campaign of, he even cleans up the temple, and he wants to re-employ the people in reconstructing the temple and making it more glorious and making it more spiritual. Well, along the way, they discover a book.
While cleaning out the buildings, the king's high priests find a scroll somewhere deep within the temple vaults.
And Hilkiah the high priest said unto Shaphan the scribe, I have found a book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to the scribe, and he read it. 2 Kings 22:8.
The document that Hilkiah is understood to have read to Josiah on that date is thought by many of us to be the laws of the book of Deuteronomy. They are laws that say you should worship God in only one place, so Josiah destroys all the other places. These are laws that say that you should not have pagan worship, so he destroys idols and removes pagan worship from his country. He is the king who follows that law code. It's an extraordinary group of laws, from ritual matters of how to sacrifice to moral matters of how you should treat one another, that you should be just, that you shouldn't oppress a widow or an orphan, that you should take care of the poor. It's an extraordinary body of laws.
The laws reveal that the people had deviated from their faith. The author of the book was clearly writing from that perspective, and was perhaps concerned about where society may be heading.
He writes in a very definite, observable style that you can see in Deuteronomy and see in 2 Kings, and you see it in one other place in the Bible. It's in the prose of the book of the prophet Jeremiah. And so I have suggested the likelihood that the same person is the author of the prose parts of the book of Jeremiah and the history that runs from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings.
The Bible tells us that the person responsible for writing down much of Jeremiah's work was his trusty scribe, Baruch.
Then took Jeremiah another scroll and gave it to Baruch the scribe, the son of Neriah. Jeremiah 36:32.
But could Baruch, the son of Neriah, have been more than a mere scribe? Could he also have written the book of Deuteronomy? His work probably speaks for itself. Many passages of text that he wrote for Jeremiah are strikingly similar to words used in Deuteronomy. Perhaps the same author may have had a hand in the writing of both books. If so, archaeology has uncovered an artifact that may have finally brought us into direct contact with one of the earliest authors of the Bible.
We, in recent years, recovered a clay seal that is now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, which is stamped in a script that we do identify as 7th century Hebrew script, late 7th, early 6th century Hebrew script, and the name in that seal is Baruch, son of Neriah, the scribe. If it's true that Baruch is our Deuteronomistic historian, what that means is when you look at that seal, you are looking at nothing less than the autograph of one of the authors of the Bible.